Every car enthusiast thinks they know the 1967 Ford Mustang. They know the fastback silhouette, the galloping pony badge, the big block rumble that turned heads on every American street corner. It has been photographed, restored, auctioned, and worshipped for nearly 60 years. But behind the chrome and the marketing brochures sits a very different story, one built on internal panic, quiet cover-ups, forgotten paperwork, and decisions Ford's own executives hoped the public would never scrutinize too closely. Today we are going deep into 20 details about the 1967 Mustang that rarely make it into the glossy retrospectives. Some of them changed the direction of the entire pony car war. Some of them were buried in dealer memos and internal correspondence for decades. And by the time we reach fact number 1, you will understand why insiders sometimes call 1967 the year Ford got lucky and didn't want anyone asking why. Before we start, drop a comment telling us which classic car deserves this same treatment next. The comment with the most likes becomes our next deep dive. Now, let's get into it. The redesign almost didn't happen at all. Most people assume Ford's design team was eager to reinvent the Mustang for 1967. Internal planning documents tell a messier story. As late as mid-1965, several members of Ford's product planning committee argued the original 19,641 RTB was still selling so well that a full redesign risked alienating loyal buyers. There was genuine internal resistance to touching a formula that was already working. The argument that ultimately won out wasn't about styling fatigue, it was about engine bay geometry. The original chassis physically could not accommodate a big block V8, and Ford's engineers were terrified of watching General Motors seize that space in the market. A faction inside Ford pushed hard for a conservative facelift instead of a structural rebuild, and for several months in early 1965, that conservative camp was winning the internal debate. Only a late executive intervention forced the wider, more aggressive redesign through in time for the 1967 model year. The interior wood trim wasn't wood, and Ford knew buyers would notice the wood grain trim that ran across the instrument panel and door caps on higher trim 1967 Mustangs looked convincing under showroom lighting. It was, in fact, a printed vinyl applique applied over stamped metal, a technique borrowed from lower-cost home furniture manufacturing of the era. Ford's marketing department was so concerned that discerning buyers would immediately recognize the material as fake, that internal sales training materials instructed dealership staff never to use the word wood unprompted. Salesmen were coached to describe it only as walnut tone applique and to redirect the conversation toward the car's performance credentials if a customer pressed the point. Several period road tests gently mocked the material anyway, noting that direct sunlight caused visible fading within a single summer. A factory speedometer error. Shipped in thousands of early units, early production 1967 Mustangs equipped with the 289 V8 left the factory with speedometers calibrated using a gear ratio intended for a different rear axle configuration. The result was a speedometer that read consistently several miles per hour slower than the car's actual speed once it exceeded roughly 50 miles per hour. The discrepancy was minor enough that most owners never noticed, but it was significant enough that several state highway patrol departments flagged inconsistencies during speed trap radar comparisons in 1967 and 1968. Ford quietly corrected the gearing on the speedometer cable assembly partway through the model year without issuing a public recall, treating it as a running production change rather than an admission of error. The fender vents were functional on exactly one batch of cars. The simulated air vents behind the front wheel arches on GT trim 1967 Mustangs are famous for being purely decorative, stamped indentations with no actual airflow purpose. What almost nobody discusses is that the very first pilot production batch, numbering only a few dozen cars built for internal engineering evaluation before the official model year launch, had genuinely functional vents designed to help cool the front brakes. Testing revealed the open vents allowed water and road debris to reach the brake components in wet conditions, causing inconsistent pedal feel. Rather than engineer a more complex solution, Ford's simplest fix was to seal the vents completely and keep the styling for its visual effect alone. A small number of these pre-production test cars reportedly survived scrapping protocols and occasionally surface at specialist auctions, identifiable by faint witness marks behind the closed-off vent openings. Ford built a secret test mule nicknamed the Median before the 1967 body was finalized. Ford's engineering division constructed a heavily disguised test mule combining the outgoing 1966 chassis with prototype body panels from the upcoming redesign. Internally, staff referred to the car as the Median because its proportions sat between the outgoing and incoming generations. The Median was driven on public roads around the Dearborn Proving Grounds, disguised with blacked-out trim and misleading badges to prevent competitor scouts and automotive journalists from identifying it. Photographs of the disguised prototype were leaked to a regional newspaper in late 1965, but the accompanying description was vague enough that the leak caused little stir. Ford's legal department reportedly considered pursuing the source of the leak, but ultimately let the matter drop, rather than draw more attention to it. A factory paint color was pulled mid-year over a chemical concern. One of the original color options offered at the start of the 1967 model year, a deep metallic called Timberline Green, used a pigment formulation that some paint suppliers had already flagged as difficult to stabilize during the baking process. Reports from several dealerships described inconsistent color matching between body panels repainted for warranty repairs and the original factory finish. Rather than resolve the formulation issue mid-cycle, Ford's purchasing department quietly reformulated the pigment blend for later production runs, resulting in subtle shade variation between early and late 1967 Mustangs painted in that color. Collectors today who know to look for it can sometimes date a car's production window simply by comparing the exact tone of its green paint against reference swatches. The famous pony emblem went through 11 rejected designs. The galloping horse emblem mounted in the center of the grille is one of the most recognized automotive logos in American history, but the version that shipped on 1967 cars was the 11th iteration considered by Ford's design studio. Early drafts included a rearing horse, a horse in full profile without motion implied, and even one concept featuring two horses side by side to suggest teamwork and reliability. Design lead disagreements over the emblem became heated enough that one senior stylist reportedly threatened to resign if a static, non-galloping version was approved. The final galloping design was chosen partly because wind tunnel testing suggested its more streamlined silhouette produced marginally less turbulence at the grille opening compared to the bulkier rejected concepts. A technical justification for what was ultimately an emotional design decision. A confidential service bulletin reveals engineers quietly fixed their own mistake. A service bulletin circulated only to authorized Ford dealerships in the spring of 1967 and never published for public reference, instructed technicians on a specific carburetor adjustment for cars built during a narrow production window in the preceding winter. The bulletin did not explain the underlying cause to dealership staff, simply providing revised idle mixture settings. Engineers later acknowledged internally that a batch of carburetors had been assembled using a metering rod specification intended for a different engine displacement, causing rough idle and inconsistent fuel economy in affected cars. Because the issue did not present a safety concern, Ford handled it entirely through quiet dealer service adjustments rather than a formal notice to owners, meaning most affected customers never learned their car had shipped with a documented internal error. The convertible top boot was originally considered too expensive to include the fitted vinyl boot that snapped over a folded convertible top to give it a finished appearance. When the top was down, was treated internally as a candidate for cost-cutting during the final budget review before 1967 production began. A cost analysis memo proposed eliminating the boot entirely and offering it only as a dealer-installed accessory to shave a small amount off the convertible's base manufacturing cost. The plan was reversed only after early prototype units were shown to a small focus group of dealership principals, several of whom warned that competing convertibles from Chevrolet and Plymouth already included the feature standard, and that its absence would be immediately noticeable on the showroom floor. The boot was reinstated as standard equipment less than 2 months before production tooling was finalized. Right-hand drive export units used a completely different firewall, stamping Mustangs built for right-hand drive markets such as Australia and parts of the British Commonwealth, required a modified firewall stamping to accommodate the relocated steering column and pedal assembly. Rather than run a separate assembly line, Ford integrated these export units into standard domestic production runs at limited intervals, meaning a small number of right-hand drive firewalls were stamped on the very same tooling used for left-hand drive American cars, simply swapped between batches. Because these export runs were infrequent and unpredictable, some of the earliest right-hand drive 1967 Mustangs shipped overseas with minor fitment inconsistencies in the dashboard assembly, requiring dealer-level adjustment upon arrival. Collectors specializing in export Mustangs consider these early right-hand drive units some of the most mechanically unusual variants of the entire model year. Ford's own legal department worried about the word Mustang in at least 3 countries. Germany's trademark conflict with the Krupp Company is the most widely discussed naming issue tied to the Mustang name abroad, but it was not the only one. Ford's International Legal Counsel flagged potential trademark conflicts in at least 2 additional overseas markets during 1966 and 1967, both involving smaller regional manufacturers who had registered similar names for unrelated products years earlier. In both cases, Ford's legal team negotiated private licensing arrangements rather than pursue renaming, paying modest annual fees to continue using the Mustang name in those territories. The existence of these secondary trademark negotiations remained buried in Ford's international legal files for decades, and rarely appears in even detailed Mustang histories, which tend to focus exclusively on the more dramatic German situation. A prototype six-cylinder performance package was developed and then shelved. While most performance attention in 1967 centered on weight options, Ford's engineering division quietly developed a performance package intended for the base six-cylinder Mustang, aimed at buyers who wanted sportier handling without the insurance premiums attached to weight models. The package reportedly included firmer suspension components, a modified exhaust manifold, and a distinct badge treatment. The project was shelved just weeks before it would have entered the option catalog, reportedly because market research suggested six-cylinder buyers overwhelmingly prioritized fuel economy and low operating cost over handling refinement, making the anticipated take rate too low to justify tooling costs. Prototype components from the abandoned package were reportedly repurposed into unrelated engineering studies rather than scrapped outright. The deluxe interior package had a documented ergonomic flaw. The deluxe interior option, prized today for its distinctive 5-dial instrument cluster and unique upholstery stitching, shipped with a documented ergonomic issue that Ford's own quality assurance team flagged before launch but did not correct. The redesigned door panel armrest sat at a height that several test drivers of shorter stature found uncomfortable during extended highway driving. Internal correspondence shows the ergonomics team recommended a half-inch adjustment to the armrest mounting position, but the change was rejected because it would have required retooling stamping dies already committed to production. The armrest height remained unchanged for the entire 1967 model year, and only received the recommended adjustment when Ford revised interior trim for the following generation. A regional Ford Zone office ran its own unauthorized advertising campaign, while Ford's national marketing department carefully controlled Mustang advertising messaging. In 1967, at least one regional zone office, covering dealerships across the upper Midwest, ran a series of newspaper advertisements emphasizing the Mustang's fuel efficiency compared to full-size sedans, a message that directly contradicted the national campaign's performance-focused branding. The unauthorized regional campaign came to national headquarters' attention only after several competing Ford dealerships outside the zone complained that the messaging was creating buyer confusion about the car's identity. The zone office was formally reprimanded and required to submit all future advertising copy for national approval, an episode that rarely surfaces in accounts of Ford's otherwise tightly coordinated 1967 marketing push. A warranty dispute over rust protection was quietly settled out of court. Several 1967 Mustang owners in coastal and northern climate states filed complaints beginning in 1969 regarding premature rust developing along the lower rocker panels, an area where the underbody rust protection coating had been applied inconsistently at certain assembly plants. A small group of affected owners in the northeastern United States pursued a joint complaint through a local consumer advocacy organization. Rather than allow the matter to escalate into a larger public dispute, Ford's legal department negotiated individual settlements covering repair costs for the affected owners, conditional on non-disclosure of the settlement terms. Because the resolution occurred quietly and outside any formal recall process, this rust protection issue remains almost entirely absent from published Mustang reliability histories, despite internal quality records acknowledging the inconsistency. The GT package's fog lamps were sourced from an entirely different Ford model line. The distinctive integrated fog lamps mounted in the front grille of GT package 1967 Mustangs were not custom-engineered components. They were adapted directly from a lamp assembly originally designed for a Ford truck line, selected because the housing dimensions happened to fit the revised grille opening without requiring new tooling. Ford's parts engineers made the substitution under significant time pressure once the redesigned grille shape was finalized, later than planned in the development schedule. The adaptation worked well enough that almost no period road tests noted the shared origin, and the practice remained undocumented publicly for years, illustrating how frequently components crossed between unrelated vehicle lines within Ford's broader parts catalog during this era. An internal memo reveals Ford considered discontinuing the Mustang name entirely for international markets, facing mounting trademark friction in multiple overseas territories. A 1966 internal strategy memo circulated among Ford's international division proposed a radical solution, abandoning the Mustang name entirely outside North America in favor of a single unified international nameplate that would sidestep trademark conflicts altogether. The proposal was seriously debated for several weeks before being rejected, largely because market research indicated the Mustang name itself, independent of any badge or trademark, was already driving significant brand recognition and cross-border demand even among buyers who had never seen an actual advertisement. Executives ultimately concluded the trademark headaches were a worthwhile cost of preserving a name that was already becoming a global cultural reference point. A pre-production unit disappeared from a secured test facility for 11 days. In late 1966, a pre-production 1967 Mustang assigned to durability testing vanished from Ford's secured proving grounds under circumstances that were never fully explained in surviving internal records. The car reappeared 11 days later, parked in the same facility, with several hundred additional miles on its odometer and minor cosmetic wear inconsistent with its documented testing schedule. An internal investigation was opened, but produced no conclusive findings, and the incident was ultimately closed with a note attributing it to unauthorized personnel access, without further detail. The affected test unit was quietly retired from the testing program shortly afterward rather than continuing its evaluation cycle, and the specific vehicle identification number tied to the incident has never been publicly confirmed. A single design sketch nearly replaced the entire fastback roofline at the last possible moment, just months before final tooling approval. A junior member of Ford's styling studio submitted an alternative fastback roofline sketch featuring a more sharply creased rear window angle, intended to differentiate the design more dramatically from the outgoing 1966 body. The sketch generated enough internal enthusiasm that senior stylists briefly considered delaying tooling approval to evaluate a full-scale clay model of the alternative design. The delay would have pushed the Mustang's launch date back by several weeks, directly conflicting with Ford's urgent timeline to beat Chevrolet's Camaro to market. Executives ultimately overruled the styling studio's request, preserving the original roofline and meeting the launch deadline. The alternative sketch survived only as a page in a design notebook, never developed beyond concept stage, though several design historians consider it a compelling glimpse of what the car might have become under different time pressure. Ford never documented exactly why the 1967 redesign succeeded as well as it did. Perhaps the most surprising fact of all is the simplest. Despite the 1967 Mustang's redesign becoming one of the most celebrated evolutions in American automotive history, Ford's own internal retrospective reports from the following decade struggled to pinpoint exactly which specific decisions made the difference. Was it the widened body proportions, the big block engine option, the fastback roofline, the timing relative to the Camaro's launch, or simply the accumulated brand momentum from 3 successful prior years? Internal Ford analysts debated this question for years without reaching consensus, and no single definitive report was ever finalized explaining the 1967 model's enduring reputation. In the absence of a clear internal explanation, the legend was left almost entirely to enthusiasts, journalists, and collectors to construct on their own, which may be exactly why the story of the 1967 Mustang has grown larger and more mythologized with every passing decade. Every one of these details sat quietly in memos, service bulletins, and internal correspondence for decades, overshadowed by the louder, more marketable story Ford chose to tell the public. The 1967 Mustang did not become a legend because every decision behind it was perfect. It became a legend because Ford, often through improvisation, quiet correction, and a fair amount of internal disagreement, managed to build something that worked anyway. That is the real secret. Not a single hidden fact, but the sheer number of imperfect human decisions stacked on top of each other that somehow produce one of the most enduring cars in American history. If you enjoyed this deep dive, let us know in the comments which classic car we should investigate next, and subscribe for more hidden automotive history.